Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw. It was a rainy night, which is often a sort of the time that I go out and shoot. And I headed out of the city, and I was on a highway that cuts through a national park, about 20 minutes from Ottawa, but it's you feel like you're really out in the country. And I was when they built the highway, they cut through a mountain, and in order to make the hill a little less steep. And so I was about 2/3 of the way down that hill, looking up it, and so you can see the rock cuts on either side of the highway. But it's all illuminated by a car, the headlights of a car that has just come over the crest of the hill and is coming down towards where I was with my camera. The picture has this sort of bright glare of the headlights of this car, and then the headlights and taillights of that car and maybe a couple of others that were up the highway were illuminating the rock walls, primarily because there was a fair bit of mist and rain in the air. So the picture's quite, I guess it's got, in the sky, there's quite a lot of texture. The rock faces have quite a lot of texture. And then there's this sort of, it feels a bit like a laser beam or something kind of coming towards you it's sort of in the middle of the photograph. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, how I would describe that picture.
Right. There's so much to talk about, and I have so many questions, and I don't know where to start because it's
sure.
Amazing.
Well,
so go ahead.
I guess that, first of all, the reason I chose that picture was, it's a technical. Shooting at night is pretty challenging. Shooting in the rain is kind of difficult. It's hard on my equipment. So my choice, like when I go and shoot and it's raining or whatever, it's really because the effect of the rain or the effect of fog or snow, that they tend to sort of have an impact on the ability to actually see the subject. Mm-hmm. So it tends to kind of fog the subject and make it a little bit difficult to see. And that's kind of what I guess if I were to say I have a kind of an approach to photography, that's what it is. It's essentially I'll choose a subject, and then I'll try to figure out circumstances in which that subject is somehow being dissolved by something. So rain, fog, snow, these things sort of dissolve a subject pretty well, or can anyway, as does light. Like depending on your position, when you're taking a photo, the light itself, like if you backlight something, for instance, it can also dissolve your subject. So in this particular picture, there are two things happening. One, there's this beam of light that's kind of shooting towards the camera. And then, of course, there's also the rain, which is making everything a little bit kind of hazy and a little bit washed out.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, I think, about you and what I associate with you is very like cinematographic, however you want to call it, cinematic, that in a way I feel like this could be a still from a very moody film. And because I kind of know that you think about this stuff, and you're immersed in the language of cinema, and that image is essentially you're making a photograph up a highway, and on the one hand it sounds so banal, but on the other hand the light is a starburst. It's like it's very arresting, and I can see why you like this image, right? But the question back to the show is, okay, I said, well, can you send me an image that speaks to you as to where your brain is and where your thinking is and where you are, I don't know, just in your life at this moment? So if you were to step back and say, and make the connection between this image and where you are in your life, what connections can you make? Because I find it amazing.
So that's thank you, first of all. And I think, you're right. Like, I think anybody who takes pictures, maybe there are people who really have a great deal of control of what happens. But for many of us, I'll shoot a lot of pictures, and I'll try to put myself in a position, in a situation, let's say, that kind of connects to a mood. I guess that's the main thing. Like the notion of, a subject being dissolved by something, I kind of like putting myself in these positions where what it is that I'm looking at kind of has a bit of a dreamlike quality. It's a little bit difficult maybe to understand it or to necessarily know exactly what it is, because it's being kind of hidden by, as I've said, the rain or the backlight or whatever. I take a lot of pictures, and then I'll go through the pictures, and I think you're right. Like, I'll try to choose the ones that I share in any event. I'll try to choose them on the basis of them sort of feeling a little bit like a moment in a story. I don't know exactly always what the story is, but there might be a sense that it could be almost like a film still, as you said. This is, this car is coming from somewhere, it's going somewhere, and based on the way the picture looks, that's not good. This guy's coming from somewhere bad. He's headed somewhere bad, or clearly he's this person driving this car is cutting through a challenging situation. Whatever the story happens to be. And to be totally honest, I just made that up on the spot.
No, I know. Of course,
I don't really remember the story behind that one, but for sure, I do try to kind of sort of set up a picture so that when you look at it, if you're kind of studying it, maybe there's a story. Right. Sometimes I'm not really looking for that. Sometimes it's just kind of a mood. So but your bigger question, like emotionally, like where does this come from? You and I know each other from doing poetry and spoken word and performance stuff back in the 90s. And, both of us have gone in certain directions. Like, you've put out books, you've done photographic series. I've done some of those same things, or I've done different things. I did in the mid 2000s, I did a master's in fine arts, which was very, I was sort of focused on very sort of conceptual and kind of landscape videos. And it was often a bit of a political statement I was trying to make. And I frankly got fed up, because I come up with these interesting concepts, but they were very boring to put into place. Like, I'd make a movie that lasted 14 hours, and I can tell you editing a 14-hour movie is, first of all, it takes a lot of equipment, it takes a lot of time, and often it's really boring. And I just got sort of fed up, and then I just stopped. I just completely stopped doing that altogether. And a number of years later, I'm a family man. I've got 2 daughters, and I was married. And in 2015, my wife left. And we'd been together. I mean, you know who I'm talking about. You've known her since we've met, actually. And so we were together for about 20 years. Most of that time we were married. And of course, anybody who's listening and has gone through a separation or a divorce, it's always, there's a sort of a violence to it. It's awful. And I found myself entirely adrift. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was doing. I felt like I was kind of floating off the ground. And that fall, so the fall of 2015, I started taking pictures. And I can remember very specifically seeing subjects being illuminated, or seeing myself in reflection, or seeing my shadow, or seeing observing something around me which was peculiar, and I would capture it usually with my phone. So I didn't have as good a camera back then. But I can also remember that being very much like, oh, wow, I still exist. There was this feeling that I would take these pictures, I would see myself in backlight, or I would have the sun shimmering in a certain way. And what I would see would be this feeling of this shimmery kind of magic dreams that I was living in. But at the same time, I felt like, oh, okay, I am here. I am solid. I'm made of something. And that became what I wanted to, that became what I wanted to film. I wanted this sort of feeling that I barely existed, that me as a subject had dissolved to the point of just being kind of a shimmery something. And everything I saw around me felt the same way. Like, everything I looked at felt like it was just kind of barely existed. Right. And so that sort of continues to be kind of what it is I'm trying to capture in my pictures.
One of the people I had a podcast with, Louise Farnay, she was like in a way like you, a commercially successful graphic artist. What's interesting there is for her the role of her creative expression for dealing with her pain, and I think interpretation and internalization of what's going on in her life. That sounded a bit of a bit like what you were I could hear echoes of that in what you were saying, right?
It's what I was just sort of laughing about was that you were describing a woman who takes photographs and then turns them into paintings that are hyper realistic. Something that people sometimes comment on my pictures is that they look like paintings. Mm-hmm. If I was to, the sort of landscape paintings of the 1800s, Turner, for example, and the sort of these incredible skies and the sky almost like crushing the land below it, that kind of thing. For sure, that's something that I sometimes see when I'm working on. I'm doing my post-production work in a picture. That picture in particular, one of the things that I do when I take pictures, I often kind of push my camera a little bit to its extremes, by which I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially a camera is a way of capturing light, right? And there are a couple of tools for that. One is the aperture, which is like the iris in your eye, and the more open it is, the more light it lets in, but at the same time, it shortens the depth of field. So if you have a very wide aperture and you're taking a portrait of somebody, for example, their nose might be in focus, but their eyes might not be in focus. Like if you've got, and the lens that I work with most often is a lens that has a wide aperture like that. Mm-hmm. The challenge with most lenses, unless maybe, you're buying like really, really high end lenses, is when you have the aperture really wide open, it tends to have some fragment, or it has the edges get a little bit blurred or vignetted or something. So that that's what I mean by putting a stress. Mm-hmm. The other stress, another way that your camera deals with light is it has a setting, which is the sensitivity, which is in film photography is called the ISO. And the higher the ISO, the more grain there is in your picture. When you're taking pictures at night, it's good to open your aperture. It's also good to have a higher ISO. But what this means is when you look at the picture up close, it's really grainy, mm-hmm. and it's kind of burned out. And that's another way that you're kind of playing a little bit with with the subject. You're sort of dissolving the subject using your camera.
I really want to share more about how you tick and who you are in terms of in terms of our relationship, because I've always known you as being rooted in some kind of narrative, I guess, of telling some kind of story, but it not necessarily being very literal. Like it's also kind of poetic narrative. So do you make a link between performance, because we did that for such a long time, and your image making, or they're kind of separated? So
it's an interesting question. So your question was about performance, and I wanted to make a little interjection here. I'm holding in my hand a little book that's held together with 3 bolts called Elfassy is a Book of Love. Copyright Ran Elfassy, 1997, Montreal, and it has a dedication. Please, Scott, please read all the lines between the lines, made while we made, and how warm can memory feel. You're a very good writer.
Shooting it raw, it's all about me.
And it's a really beautiful little book. It's all about love. It's great. So I come back to your question about performance. So I don't know if this is performance exactly, but what I was thinking was that when I take a picture, I see, whatever it is I'm looking at, and there's objectively what my eyes will allow me to see. And then, of course, there's a subjective layer on top of that. So, depending on what mood I'm in, or depending on what I've experienced, or where I'm at in my life. So I described earlier this kind of like coming out of a challenging separation and feeling like I was completely lost. And so the sort of that subjective layer for a long time was I'm in a dream state. Everything feels like it's unreal, and how can I find a way to capture that? And I've kind of tried to keep that idea of subjectivity alive. So I take a picture. I've got a really nice camera with a couple of really nice lenses, and then I do quite a lot of post-production work on my pictures. And so post-production work is really a question of balancing the light, the levels, and so on, the color, the white balance, and so on. So a sky, just to give a simple example, if you shoot a sky in a city at night, it's kind of yellowy green. and it's often not particularly impressive the way it comes out in your photograph before you spend a little bit of time finding the actual light that you saw or the light that you felt. So in a sense, my work on my pictures, I try to be very honest. Like I try to really honestly say, this is what I see, knowing that part of what I see is also what I'm feeling. It's not just what I actually see. If there's a mood, maybe that's where the mood comes from. Part of the reason I chose that picture in particular to share with you, and hopefully other people will see it somehow, there was a certain kind of an intensity. And at the time that I took that picture, I had not long before that done a ayahuasca retreat. I don't know if you're familiar with ayahuasca, but it's a psychedelic plant from South America, and it's a bit like it has an effect like LSD or magic mushrooms or whatever, but it's not really taken in a party circumstance. It's taken in a more sort of ceremonial way. So you do it in a retreat, and there's an intention to what you're doing, and you drink this tea, and then you go on a fairly intense or really intense journey, and that journey helps you understand more about yourself, or helps you sort of through struggles you might be having, whatever. And I came out of doing that, and like all of a sudden, the world around me became considerably more intense. Like colors were brighter. Everything was imbued with meaning where there really hadn't been meaning before. It felt for maybe a 2-month period after I'd taken this, almost like I was living in one of those dreams where in a dream where a person walks into the room, you don't necessarily know who that person is or whatever, but they're really significant for some reason. That oh yes, well this is really bad that this person is now here. This is really bad, or it's fantastic this person has showed up, or whatever it happens to be. But so everything was kind of imbued with this sort of magic intensity. Yeah. And so that picture has this kind of like zapping kind of thing happening. Well, that was kind of what I saw.
There's that whole sort of perspective or way people talk about photography is, and this is true for people doing selfies. This is true for all pictures, right? Like even the crappy like group photo, whatever it is, right? That your whole experience in your life is what it kind of shapes why your intention and why you stopped and why you kind of put the camera forward and then looked through the thing and just expected to create an image or to freeze the scene in front of you, and that your whole it's this idea that your whole life history and experience informs your action to sort of trip the shutter. So the very fact that you're driving, it's raining, you've got your camera gear in the car, it's wet. You just came out of that retreat, so colors are super rich and intense, and then you come up onto the scene, and so you have the idea that you looked up the highway, and so for at least 100 meters, that's about 100 yards. So 100 meters, you're looking up, and you're like, oh shit, okay, I'm gonna stop the car. So you pull over to the side of the road, and then you get out of the car, and in a way, that's part of the image making experience, right? Where you're walking around in the street, and you're like, you have your camera in your hand. And then you may have taken a whole bunch of images, but the one that you settled on was the one that's framed like this.
Well, what I think you just said is that a photograph is a document of a performance.
Okay.
In a way. You don't actually you don't see the performance, you see what the performer sees.
Right.
I think that's what you said. I think it's a very generous idea to think that any choice, anytime you click the shutter, that's a evidence of your entire life's
subconscious
set of choices.
Subconscious.
Sure. Sure. I can tell you, I take piles of really shit photographs that nobody ever sees. Right. So I think
me too, man.
I guess the reality is that, sure. Yeah, I guess it is.
I'm not trying to convince you. I'm just sort of.
Maybe it's a selfish thing, and maybe the pictures that I take that I'm about the way I describe this experience, maybe they're not my strongest pictures. I'm not sure. That's probably fair enough to say, but.
So is life really a gift? Really? Can you make every second count? That's the whole point of the podcast. So if you like what you've seen, and you're inspired, because that really is my mission, then please give it a like, subscribe, and share.
Shooting it raw?
Yes, shooting it raw.